Hello and welcome to this short discussion of the lessons that we've learned from our initial phases of the MyEd trial in the English department this year. Now don't forget that we've only been working with this program, this platform now for 10 weeks, and these really are some of our initial reflections. We're going to look at a few different areas here today. The first few are really the how-to and the nuts and bolts of using the actual program itself. Some of the more specific elements here in terms of the functionality of the assessments in the marks book and how using MyEd can impact your marks book quite significantly. Then we're looking at other areas like the validity of results, and there's always Wi-Fi and networking or infrastructure concerns that we need to be mindful of. And then we'll look at a few other areas that we've reflected on over the last little while as well, such as the dynamics of the class and what some of our students are giving us as feedback. And then I'll ask some questions about how we can measure success of this particular program. First and foremost, one of the initial professional development phases is looking at your Quest library and really establishing the structures within that. So I might just take you through and give you a quick look at the Quest library that we currently have for English. And as you can see, we've got just a department folder here with all of the English teachers as collaborators. Then we have all of our courses listed. And because we're only trialling with Year 8, that's the only one with any materials in it. And then we break it down according to the units of work that we do within the Year 8 course. So the main one we've been focusing on recently is this novel study on the Australian novel Crow Country. But we're also dipping in and out sporadically into the grammar and spelling. So it's your filing system, and you want to make sure that you set this up in a sensible and logical fashion, just so anyone can navigate their way through it and find the quests that they're actually using. Within our Crow Country one, in order to facilitate our differentiation of the activities a little bit more, we have broken our study into a range of chapters, so chunks of 4, because that's about a week's worth of work. And then we have the blue activities that you can see here, and they're I suppose the mainstream activities. They're the ones that the majority of students would be likely to complete. Our green activities are for those students with who need a little bit more support. So the activities in there are a little bit more simplistic, and we put more support structures within the activities in that range. And then the red activities are for students who can perhaps work a bit more independently, and we push them a little bit more in terms of what we expect from the red activities. So it's logical. You need to make sure that you really structure this in a way that's going to be manageable in the long term. Now, the other point that I've got listed here is there really is this need for you to be able to gather and create resources. And if you're not willing to do that, then just like other platforms, even Sector itself, or Sector Learn as it's now called, it's not going to be as effective as it possibly can. Now, one of the things that we use quite frequently within the English department is YouTube clips, as I'm sure is the case across a number of learning areas, but these are the sorts of clips that we're now recording, the tutorial, instructional resources that we're now developing as a department. And this really is the next step for us, and where we're at in terms of trying to develop resources that are appropriate for all students, or for a range of students, and yet we can allow them to access them at their will in a time when they're actually ready to use them. I don't know that a system like this is going to work if staff are not willing to either gather those kinds of resources, and that takes time, or to produce them themselves, which takes a significant amount of time, really. Now, in terms of differentiation, we're not experts, and so what we've decided to do initially is to essentially use the structure of Bloom's taxonomy to guide us in different ways of being able to differentiate our activities. So if our typical level of activity is usually some sort of analysis that we have to do with the text here, and we are focusing on a novel study, so we do want students to be able to analyse the text, and some of these verbs here that we request or we require them to be able to perform are the common sorts of activities we might give students at that mid-level. Now, obviously, if we have students operating at a lower level, we're going to just shift down a level or two in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, and we might even go as low as trying to get students to remember certain parts of the text so that they can utilize that for an activity or an assessment. But most of all, we'll be looking at questions about exploring their understanding and eventually pushing them through the different layers. For our more capable students, we can get them straight into an evaluating question, or even get them creating different things. So whilst we don't have the differentiation side of things completely down pat, and we are limiting our differentiation to 3 levels at this stage, we've decided to model it on Bloom's taxonomy just to give us a bit of a framework to work with. The next thing you need to really be careful of is the functionality of the different assessment tools, and you're not going to be familiar with this until you test a few of them out, and until you really have a look at the sorts of things that you can achieve with these different tools. And each one obviously is useful for different contexts, so depending on what it is you wish to gain from the students and their and how you wish to assess their learning at this phase of the learning process will determine which one you're going to use. So there are ones like the capture learning or the capture learning one is probably the most flexible, because students get to choose how they can respond to the question or activity that you give to them. Table responses, you can set a specific number of entries that you would like students to add into the table that you establish. So it's a good way of summarizing information really quickly. True-false questions are great because they can mark themselves, and as can multiple choice questions. So depending on what it is you're hoping to achieve and the sorts of feedback you want to give, because if you ask students to provide a text response or a discussion or to draw a response, then yeah, you'll be expected to provide some feedback on that. If it's multiple choice or true-false, then the system can provide that feedback instantaneously as soon as students complete the tasks themselves. Now, as I was mentioning previous slide, there is the option for feedback. Now, feedback can be students getting something as simple as this work is, or this response is correct or incorrect. And it can be that simple, and you just toggle between those two answers. You can also choose to provide marks, and you select what scale you mark those out of. You can have a word scale like the one listed here below, and you can edit this if you wish, but it is well below expected to well above expected, and you can adjust those to suit the language that's more familiar to your subject area, or even to perhaps the judging standards associated with your learning area. Number scale is very similar, but obviously it doesn't have the descriptions, and you can even add something as a percentage if you choose, if you wanted to be that specific. Now, when you set the format of your feedback, that will be carried across all the students that complete that same question or activity, so you'll be expected to fill that in for all students completing that quest. This process can be quite quite quick at times. So if you only want to look at what is correct and incorrect, and you set up your questions quite logically, or if you take the time to set them up as multiple choice or true-false questions, then your feedback will be reduced. But it isn't a difficult task to go through and add quick comments or quickly tick on where they fit on these scales before you can move on to the next question. And then you just simply hit save, mark and feedback and move on to the next question. It is my understanding, even though it's not available yet, that they are working on the possibility of providing video feedback. So you'll be able to click on again something from the drop down menu like this, whereby the camera built into your device will pop up, open, and you can record yourself speaking your feedback to your students. But that's something that's in the pipeline and not yet available to us. The Marksbook Nightmare. As you can see here, this is our overview of assessments for Year 8 English for this year. And typically speaking, we would have 10 assessments over the course of the year. But there are more than double that in terms of the entries of assessments here. And that's simply because every time you add a quest, you're adding an assessment. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that you set up the different assessment types quite early on in the year and make sure that you're using those appropriately. And I can show you how to do that very quickly if I just head to my Marksbook here. You'll notice that these are my assessments that we would typically run throughout the course of the year, and then over here I have all of the MyEd materials. Now this is a special section on grammar and spelling, and we've run one quest for that section, and these are all the other quests for our novel study unit. And you'll notice there are gaps, and that's because different students are operating at different levels, so they're not always going to be complete lines of results, unfortunately. Now these ones here are non-assessed and they have a 0 weighting, and that's because I've been able to set it up and have 3 different types of assessments for this particular program. Now to do that, once you go into your assessment icon here and you want to go into groups and types, typically speaking you will only have one, and it will be all assessments, and that has a weighting of 100%. I've now added grammar and spelling and the MyEd non-assessed tasks, so that once we go into an actual activity and we do this through the overview of assessments, I can choose what kind of activity or assessment that is. And you'll notice here that I've just made this one a MyEd non-assessed task, and that organises it in our Marksbook quite clearly, so that we're not upsetting the weightings that we've established or published and said that we're going to mark to at the beginning of the year. It is fiddly and it is quite cumbersome at times, particularly if you've got multiple classes running those same in the same course. But once it's established and once you set up the structures of having the different assessment groups, it really is just a case of making sure you tick those drop down menus. But it can be overwhelming in the initial phases, but easy to overcome. So we've had a look at setting up the Marksbook and making sure you've got your different assessment types. Now we've also had at times questions about the validity of the marks that we are receiving from the students. Now depending on whether you're using MyEd as formative assessment or summative assessment, we would treat these marks very differently. Now there have been instances where we've looked at, and this isn't just the case for the English department, I know that there was some difficulties with PE classes as well, whereby students completed an online quiz mostly of multiple choice questions in the hope that it would mark itself and that we could provide very quick feedback in terms of students' understanding of those topics. Unfortunately, as students complete these questions, it doesn't lock them out from trialing or having a second attempt at that question. So if you've got students completing multiple choice questions and they have up to 4 attempts at it, then they can pretty much guarantee they're going to get 100% because they'll know that all their previous attempts have been incorrect, and they'll just keep trying and trying again until they get 100%. So you've got to make sure that you set up the different activities or your assessments in a way that is actually going to provide you with valid results. Now, I've contacted MyEd, I should say, about this issue, and they said they will have a look into this for us. So it may be the case that they might roll out a change to whether or not students can have multiple attempts at questions, or teachers may at least be able to control that functionality. One of the most concerning or most frustrating elements of this trial has been Wi-Fi connections. Now, for a platform that is completely and utterly online and dependent on internet access, any slowing of the internet or any difficulty in logging in has quite detrimental effects on the lesson as well as student learning and their engagement with the lesson. So if this trial is successful and we are looking at expanding or continuing in following years, then it's probably going to mean that we will have to look at the effects that this program is having on the network, and whether or not any changes or any expansions need to be made in terms of hardware or infrastructure, or whether it's already set up to cope with it. But there have been quite a number of issues with students not being able to log on at different times. Please understand that some of those are because of the devices not being set up properly, or students not being not having authenticated correctly. So it is possible to problem solve a lot of those issues. There are also, it has been brought to my attention that some students find it difficult to log into MyEd at home. So I don't know what would be causing that. It's something obviously in the settings of the networks that people are using at home. Some students seem to be logging in at home just fine. So that's something that would need to be explored in a lot more detail, but difficult given that we don't have any control over home networks and how students access the internet at home. Another thing that I would like to discuss is the dynamics of the class, and if we are going to change the way we approach teaching and learning, it is going to have an effect on the dynamics of the class. And I dare say that even in the first few weeks of this trial, there has been considerably more time spent on preparation of lesson materials, and it's simply because we're doing it in a way that we haven't really before. And there are ways to lessen the impact there, or to mitigate the severity of such an impact. But at the end of the day, if you are going to try something like the MyEd platform, then you do have to be prepared for the workload that goes with that. Now, we wouldn't do that if we didn't think it was worthwhile, and there are some benefits from spending all of that additional time in lesson preparation. And one of those is being able to have much more time working with individuals and groups in the class. So rather than being the teacher at the front directing the lesson and using a lot of class time for direct instruction, it takes away using MyEd, particularly in that sort of flipped classroom style, frees up a lot more of the class time to actually work with students on an individual or small group basis. So not only are we differentiating and providing activities that are perhaps more appropriate to their level of understanding, but we're also freeing ourselves up in many ways to provide individualised support in completing those activities as well. I also think in terms of the changes to the classroom dynamics that it gives staff and the teachers involved greater opportunity to actually monitor progress and to make judgments about student progress. And we're not just waiting till we get the occasional glimpse at some sort of formative task, or we're not waiting till the end of the unit where we have the summative assessment and we can have a clear understanding of exactly how well some students are performing. So because of the regular feedback that's built into the MyEd software, it does give us a much greater opportunity to keep a much closer eye on student progress without interfering with them, because all of that side of it's done in the background. One of the comments that I've received from a couple of teachers, and I have noticed this myself a little bit too, is that there is a feeling that MyEd can slow down the teaching process a little. And I don't know that that's a product of MyEd or if it's a product of the connections and the issues that we have with students actually logging into the platform itself. So it's certainly something that we'll have to pay attention to and try and find ways to work around. Because if that is the case, then that certainly will be detrimental to the student outcomes and in terms of the learning outcomes. But again, I think it's something that we might be able to remedy. As with any series of lessons or with any trial like this, we're always going to have a look at what the students think about a program like this, and by far the most frequent concern that students had for me was their frustrations with their login issues, their connection issues, be it at school or at home. And to me, that was them attempting to actually get in, to get the work done. It wasn't just saying, I can't get in, I don't want to do this, and giving up. I think there was a genuine attempt to want to get in so that they could complete the activities that had been assigned to them. Some students had difficulties too with submitting work and found it necessary to resubmit work. Now, I'm not sure that this is really a problem with the platform itself, rather developing the right habits. Students need to develop the right habits in making sure that once they enter work, they actually submit it as well. Because whilst the program does auto-save the work as it's completed, it won't necessarily submit it for teacher marking or teacher checking until they go through that process correctly. Some students have identified, or at least discussed with me, that they have difficulties working on their own, and I'm glad that they've identified this, because I think this highlights the need for us to actually explicitly teach some of these skills. We can't expect students to become independent learners unless we teach them how to do so. So by them articulating this concern, I think that's actually quite an important step for them, and they're more aware of how they process information and how they learn, perhaps than what we give them credit for. But we need to teach them to be completely aware of the learning process and how they learn, and teach them skills in metacognition perhaps, so that they can become self-directed and independent learners. Many of my students said that they enjoyed the freedom of that MyEd provided for them, because they didn't need me to get them going. I wasn't holding them back. They were able to pursue things at their own pace. There's also the suggestion that it was good in terms of not having to essentially take their files home, or not to have to take too much work home, because everything was on their iPad. Everything was quite honestly available for them online, so they didn't have to stress about the difficulties with completing handwritten work in their books or in their notes and then submitting that work to me in some way, shape or form. So that was definitely a positive for them. A lot of them liked the feedback and liked the idea of getting feedback on work that they were doing throughout the week without having to have their books collected. So there was no interruption to their learning there, and they could continue to get that feedback. And that is definitely one of the stronger aspects, one of the most impressive elements of MyEd that is up and going straight away. A few mentioned too that they like the clearly established goals. So by chunking information in a quest, and a quest could be something that you complete in 5 minutes, or it could be something that you complete over the course of a month, depending on how much detail and how many activities you really wanted to put into that. But students liked the idea of having those clearly established goals and expectations, and knowing that they had to work towards them over the course of a week. In the instance that we've been discussing, we've been looking at how we chunk the activities into a weekly basis. Some students have actually identified or suggested really that they would like an opportunity to select the level of work they complete. So whereby, in terms of differentiating the work, we perhaps have assigned students to different levels of work or different work to each student. Some students have said, well, actually we'd like to choose the level that we complete for that particular set of tasks or that set of activities. And I think that fits in really nicely with the idea of becoming independent learners and knowing what their strengths and weaknesses are, so that they can make good decisions about how they approach tasks like this in the future. And for Year 8 students to be willing to do that, I think that speaks volumes for their desire to take advantage of what the MyEd platform provides them. Now, I don't really have a good answer to this question, how do we measure success? And because there are so many different elements that we need to take into consideration here. And I think before the trial goes much further, we will need to establish pretty firm understandings of what it is we're hoping to see by the end of our trial in terms of measuring whether it is worth pursuing or not. Up until this point, we've really been looking at what it is and how to use it. And I think now that we are more familiar with the platform and what it offers, we should be able to have a look at planning the outcomes we wish to achieve by the end of the year now. So we'll obviously want to look at the empirical data. We want to look at the results, and whether we compare those with students from previous years, or whether we look at the quality of work from previous years, we can at least we can check in some way, hopefully, whether we are getting a stronger result out of students after having taught them via through the MyEd platform. Obviously, anecdotal evidence from teachers and from students. I've just noticed that students are spelt incorrectly on this slide. That's what happens when you type things up quite late of an evening. I'll fix that before I publish this online. But then there's all these other areas that we have an interest in, I suppose, at the moment, in terms of where our college is heading with engagement and well-being, and even to some extent the rate of assessment completion. So having students building resilience and being able to achieve certain goals rather than suffering from anxiety and not being able to achieve or complete these tasks in a timely manner. I think they too need to be considered when we look at the success of this, and if we are able to improve well-being and improve engagement and reduce stress levels because we're providing work at an appropriate level for each student, then they are definitely measures of success worthy of consideration. But, as I said, we need to probably define that a little bit more thoroughly. Well, that brings us to the end of this presentation. I hope that provides you with a few highlights in terms of the mistakes we've made and what we've learnt out of making those mistakes, so that you can avoid making them yourself should you wish to trial this program at some stage.